Most men don't realize they're in trouble. Not because they're reckless, not because they failed, but because everything looks like it's working. The house is there, the car is better than it used to be, vacations happen, the kids are doing okay, income is higher than it's ever been. On paper, it looks like progress. In reality, something else is happening quietly underneath. A slow tightening, a kind of financial gravity that gets stronger every year but never announces itself. By the time most men notice it, they're already too deep to move easily. That's the part nobody talks about, because the real risk in your 50s isn't collapse, it's stability. Hi, my name is Bryony, and I spend way much time thinking about why people who look financially reckless are sometimes better prepared for disaster than people who did everything right. If you've ever felt vaguely unsettled about how dependent your entire financial life is on one company, subscribe and hit "It's looking fine" while the margin disappears. It's building a life that feels successful, but leaves you with fewer and fewer options. And the strange part is, this doesn't happen because of bad decisions. It happens because of good ones, reasonable ones, decisions that made sense at the time. That's what makes this dangerous, because you don't question decisions that once felt right. You defend them, you build around them, you double down on them, until one day you realize they're not assets anymore, they're weight. Imagine something for a second, not a metaphor, something physical. Picture a massive anchor, heavy, solid, built to hold something in place. Now imagine it's made of gold, polished, impressive, expensive. People can see it from a distance and recognize what it represents: effort, achievement, status. Now imagine you've dropped several of these over the side of your life. One for your house, one for your monthly obligations, one for the lifestyle you've built, one for the expectations people have of you. Each one made sense when you added it. Each one felt like progress. And each one does exactly what an anchor is designed to do. It keeps you from drifting. That's the benefit, until conditions change. Because anchors don't care whether the water is calm or rising. They don't adjust. They don't lift themselves. They hold. And if the environment shifts fast enough, they don't protect you. They trap you. That's the part most people miss. The things that made you feel secure can become the exact things that remove your flexibility. And in your 50s, flexibility is everything. Because this is the decade where timing starts to matter more than effort. You don't have unlimited years left for recovery. You don't have multiple decades for compounding to quietly fix mistakes. What you've built now has to carry you forward. And what you've built is heavy, expensive, and rigid. It doesn't carry you. You carry it. Let's talk about how this actually happens in real life. Not theory, not extremes. Normal lives. Normal decisions, normal outcomes. There's a pattern that shows up over and over again. It starts with a simple question people ask themselves for years. Can I afford this? And the way most people answer that question is very specific. They look at the monthly payment. If the number fits inside their income, they say yes. That's it. No deeper calculation, no long-term modeling, just does it clear the account? And to be fair, that approach works for a while. In your 30s, it feels harmless. In your 40s, it feels manageable. But across 20 to 25 years, something starts to build. Not one big mistake, a stack, a layered structure of commitments. Mortgage, car payments, insurance, subscriptions, schooling. Lifestyle upgrades that quietly become permanent. None of them look dangerous individually, but together they create something very specific, a baseline cost of existence that keeps rising. And once that baseline gets high enough, it starts to control your decisions, because now you're not choosing how to live, you're maintaining what already exists. That's a very different position.
And most people don't notice the shift when it happens. They just feel busier, more responsible, more committed. But what's really happening is that their financial life is becoming less flexible, less adjustable, more fixed. Here's what that looks like in numbers. Imagine someone in their early 50s earning a strong income. They've done well. They've climbed. They're earning more now than ever before. But their expenses have grown alongside them. Not recklessly, gradually. A better house, a nicer car, a few added comforts, things that made sense at each stage. Now, before they spend $1 on food, travel, or anything optional, they already owe a large portion of their income to fixed commitments, not choices, commitments, things that are difficult to unwind quickly. And here's where the illusion breaks. From the outside, this person looks financially stable. From the inside, they're operating with almost no margin. If income stops or drops, the structure doesn't shrink. It stays exactly the same. And that's where the pressure comes from. Not from lack of income, but from lack of flexibility. Because flexibility is what allows you to respond when life changes. And life does change, especially in your 50s. This is the decade where multiple pressures begin to show up at the same time, not one at a time, together. And most financial plans don't account for that. They assume a smooth path, steady income, predictable markets, controlled expenses. But reality doesn't move like that. It clusters. Things arrive at once. And when they do, your ability to adjust becomes the difference between stability and stress. Now there's something even more subtle happening beneath all of this, a psychological shift. It's quiet, but it's powerful. In your earlier years, your focus is expansion, building, growing, taking risks, trying things. By your late 40s and early 50s, that starts to change. You become more protective. You think less about building and more about preserving. That feels responsible. It feels like maturity. But here's the catch. If you're protecting the wrong things, that instinct becomes expensive. Because what most people end up protecting isn't actual wealth. It's the appearance of stability, the lifestyle, the identity, the structure they've built. And maintaining that structure costs money every single month, whether you notice it or not. That cost doesn't pause. It doesn't negotiate. It runs continuously in the background. And if your income is tied to maintaining that same structure, you're locked in. That's the hidden trade. You get the appearance of success in exchange for reduced freedom. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to reverse. Because unwinding it means making visible changes, downsizing, cutting things, letting go of certain signals. And that's uncomfortable, not financially, socially, psychologically, which is why most people delay it. They tell themselves they'll adjust later, when things are clearer, when there's more time, when it becomes necessary. But later is exactly when flexibility matters the most, and that's where the real problem starts to form. Not because someone made a bad decision, but because they never stopped to calculate what all the good decisions added up to. That total matters more than any individual choice, because your future isn't shaped by one big move, it's shaped by the structure you've built over time. And if that structure is heavy, fixed, and expensive to maintain, it doesn't matter how successful you look. You're operating with constraints you can't easily see. And constraints are what limit options. Options are what create freedom. Remove the options, and everything starts to narrow, quietly, gradually, until one day it's obvious. But by then, changing direction takes more effort than most people expect.
There's a detail most people never run. Not because it's complicated, but because it's uncomfortable. When people think about retirement, they imagine a straight line. Savings go up steadily. Investments grow at an average rate. At some point, the number becomes enough. That's the model. Clean, predictable, reassuring, and completely misleading. Because the market doesn't move in straight lines. It moves in sequences, and the order of those sequences matters more than the average. This is where things start to break. Two people can have identical returns over time, same percentages, same long-term average, and end up in completely different positions. Not because of what they earned, but because of when those returns happened. That's the part most plans ignore, timing inside the sequence. Let's make this real. Picture someone approaching retirement. They've done what they were supposed to do. They saved consistently. They invested. They stayed patient. Now they're close, a few years out. Everything looks on track. Then something shifts, not permanently, just temporarily. The market drops, not a small dip, a real one, the kind that shows up every decade or so. Suddenly, their portfolio is down significantly. On paper, it doesn't look catastrophic because over time, markets recover. That's the belief, and historically, it's true. But here's the problem.
Recovery takes time, and time behaves differently depending on where you are in life. If you're 35, a downturn is inconvenient. If you're 60, it's structural, because now you're not just investing, you're withdrawing, and that changes everything. When your portfolio drops while you're still adding to it, you're buying at lower prices. That works in your favor. When your portfolio drops while you're taking money out, you're selling at lower prices, repeatedly, month after month, year after year. That doesn't just reduce your balance, it damages the foundation your future depends on. Because the money you withdraw during a downturn doesn't get a chance to recover, it's gone, and the remaining balance has to carry more weight with less support. This is where the illusion of average returns breaks down, because averages don't reflect lived experience. They smooth everything out. They hide volatility. They assume patience without pressure. But real life includes pressure. Bills don't pause because markets dip. Expenses don't adjust themselves. So withdrawals continue, even when conditions are worst. And that's how a manageable plan becomes fragile. Not instantly, gradually. At first, it feels temporary. Then it starts to stretch longer than expected. And by the time recovery fully arrives, there's less capital left to benefit from it. That gap doesn't close. It compounds silently. This is one of the most underestimated risks in financial life, not because it's rare, but because it's misunderstood. People prepare for not having enough. They don't prepare for what happens if things go wrong at the wrong time. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in your 50s, because now you're close enough for timing to matter, but not far enough to easily recover. That middle zone is where most people sit, and it's more fragile than it looks. Now, layer something else on top of that. Fees, not the obvious kind, not the ones that feel large, the small ones, the ones expressed in percentages, the ones that look insignificant in isolation, because percentages don't trigger emotion. A fraction of a percent feels harmless, almost invisible, but percentages compound, quietly, consistently, relentlessly, and over time, they take far more than people expect. Imagine two identical portfolios, same starting amount, same market returns, same behavior. The only difference is cost. One pays a higher annual fee, the other keeps costs minimal. At first, the difference is barely noticeable. A few hundred here, a few thousand there. Nothing that feels urgent, nothing that demands attention. But over a decade, that gap widens. Over 15 years, it becomes significant.
And the strange part is, it never feels dramatic while it's happening. Because it's not taken all at once. It leaves in small pieces, quarter by quarter, statement by statement. Too small to react to, too consistent to notice, until you actually calculate it. And when you do, it's not a detail, it's a decision. Because that money didn't disappear, it moved from your future to somewhere else. And once you see that clearly, it's hard to unsee. Now combine these two forces, timing risk and cost. One affects when your money grows or shrinks. The other affects how much of that growth you actually keep. Individually, they're manageable. Together, they can quietly reshape your entire outcome. And most people never model them at the same time. They look at returns, or they look at fees, rarely both together, and almost never under stress conditions. That's where the blind spot is. Because plans built on smooth assumptions don't survive uneven reality. They look solid, right up until they're tested, and by then, adjustment options are limited. Now, let's bring this back to real life again, because this isn't just about markets or math, it's about what happens around you at the same time all of this is unfolding. Your 50s aren't just financially sensitive, they're personally complex. Multiple responsibilities start to overlap, not sequentially, simultaneously, and each one has a cost, sometimes financial, sometimes emotional, usually both. You may start supporting people in ways you didn't expect, not out of obligation, out of necessity. Because situations change, health changes, circumstances shift, and suddenly you're carrying more than just your own plan. At the same time, the support you've been providing for years doesn't disappear, it evolves. New phases bring new expenses, different kinds of pressure, different timelines. And all of it lands during the same window where your financial margin matters most. This is where the idea of "I'll figure it out later" starts to fail.
because later arrives with more variables than expected and fewer degrees of freedom. That's the combination that creates stress, not lack of effort, not lack of intelligence, just too many moving parts hitting at once and no clear room to adjust. Now add one more layer, uncertainty. Not dramatic, catastrophic uncertainty, just life shifting in ways you didn't plan for. Relationships change, circumstances evolve. Things that felt stable aren't as fixed as they once seemed. And when those shifts happen later in life, they carry a different weight. Because now everything is more intertwined. Financial structures, living situations, long-term plans. When one piece moves, others move with it. And the cost of that movement is rarely small. It's disruptive, not just financially, systemically. This is why the margin matters so much, because margin is what absorbs shocks. Without it, every change feels amplified, every decision feels heavier, every adjustment feels more permanent. And that's where people start to feel stuck, not because there are no solutions, but because every solution requires giving something up. And when you've spent decades building a certain life, that's not easy to do quickly. So most people delay. They hold things in place. They wait for clarity, for better conditions, for the right time. But time in this phase is not neutral, it's active. Every year that passes without adjustment reduces your flexibility, not dramatically, but steadily. And steady changes are the ones people miss, because they don't feel urgent until they are. That's the pattern. Not sudden collapse, gradual tightening. Everything still functioning, but with less room to move. And that's what makes this phase of life uniquely challenging, because the risks aren't obvious. They're embedded, inside timing, inside cost, inside structure. And unless you step back and look at all of it together, it's easy to miss what's actually happening. Which brings us to something even subtler, something that doesn't show up in spreadsheets, but shapes decisions just as much as numbers do. And once you see it, you start to understand why people stay in situations that no longer serve them. Not because they have to, but because walking away feels more expensive than staying.
There's a cost most people never calculate. Not because it's hidden, but because it doesn't show up as a number anywhere. You won't find it on a statement. No one sends you a bill for it. And yet, over time, it becomes one of the most expensive parts of your life. It's the cost of maintaining how things look. Not extravagance, not reckless spending. Just the quiet, ongoing pressure to remain consistent with the version of yourself the world has already seen. By your 50s, you're not anonymous anymore. You've built a reputation in your work, in your social circle, in your environment. People know you as something reliable, successful, established. That identity took years to build, and once it exists, it starts to carry expectations, not necessarily spoken ones, but understood ones. You live in a certain kind of place. You drive a certain level of car. You participate in certain environments. You take certain kinds of trips. None of these things feel extreme. They feel normal because they match the world around you. But normal has a cost, and that cost repeats every month, quietly, consistently. What makes this tricky is that these decisions rarely feel like trade-offs. They feel like continuity. You're not upgrading, you're maintaining, and maintaining feels responsible. It feels like you're holding things together. But here's the part most people don't stop to consider. Maintaining a lifestyle requires continuous input. Money, energy, time, attention. And the higher that lifestyle sits, the more input it demands. That's not a problem if your flexibility is intact, but if your structure is already tight, that input becomes pressure. Now, imagine two people who followed very similar paths. Same education, same field, same general income over time. They both did well. They both advanced. They both reached a point where, from the outside, everything looked solid. But their decisions around maintenance were slightly different. Not dramatically, just enough. One of them prioritized alignment with their environment. They stayed in the right areas, kept the expected standards, made choices that matched the people around them. Nothing excessive, just consistent. Over time, that consistency locked in a certain cost of living, a certain expectation, a certain baseline that couldn't easily be reduced without it being noticeable. The other person made different adjustments, not extreme ones, just deliberate ones. They didn't always choose the highest standard available. They chose what was sufficient, comfortable but not stretched. They allowed small mismatches between themselves and their environment.
Nothing obvious, just enough to keep their cost structure lower. Over a few years, the difference didn't look dramatic. Both lives looked successful, both seemed stable. But over a decade, the gap started to widen. Not in income, in flexibility. One had to keep earning at a high level just to maintain what already existed. The other had room to save more, room to invest consistently, room to adjust if needed. And that room compounds, because flexibility allows better decisions. Better decisions lead to stronger outcomes. Stronger outcomes create more options. It's a loop, a reinforcing one, and it starts small. Now, here's the part that makes this difficult to confront. The person who maintained the higher cost lifestyle isn't unaware. At some level, they can feel it. The pressure, the dependence on continued income, the lack of margin. But stopping isn't simple, because unwinding that structure isn't just a financial decision, it's a visible one. It changes how things look, where you live, how you show up, what people assume. And that creates resistance. Not logical resistance, emotional resistance, social resistance. The kind that's hard to quantify, but very real to experience. So instead of adjusting early, most people delay. They keep everything in place. They tell themselves it's temporary, that they'll rebalance later, when there's more time, more clarity, more stability. But stability in this context is misleading, because the structure itself is what's creating the pressure. Maintaining it doesn't solve the problem. It extends it, and over time it limits your options further. That's the real cost, not the money spent, the options lost. Because options are what give you control, the ability to step away, to change direction, to say no, to choose differently. Without options, you don't choose, you respond, you react, you continue, even when continuing isn't what you actually want. Now let's connect this back to something concrete. Two individuals, same income, same time frame, different outcomes. Not because one was smarter, not because one had better opportunities, because their structures were different. One built a life that required constant high input. The other built a life that could function on less. That difference doesn't show up immediately, but over 10, 15 years, it becomes undeniable. Because savings rates diverge, investment balances diverge, stress levels diverge, and eventually futures diverge. One person reaches a point where stepping back is possible. The other reaches a point where continuing is necessary. Same starting line, different flexibility. And flexibility is what determines whether you have a choice later. Now here's where this becomes even more important. Because this isn't just about lifestyle, it's about identity. When your identity is tied to your output, to your role, to your position, stepping back feels like losing something. Not just income, status, relevance, recognition. That's a powerful force, stronger than most financial logic, because humans don't just optimize for numbers, they optimize for meaning, for belonging, for consistency with how they see themselves. And when those things are tied to a structure that requires constant input, you stay in the structure, even if it's no longer serving you. That's why some people keep working longer than they need to, not because they have no money, because they have no separation between who they are and what they do, and changing that feels harder than continuing, so they continue. But here's the trade. Every year you continue in a structure that requires high output, you delay the point where you gain control over your time. You delay optionality. You delay freedom. Not in an obvious way, in a gradual one. And gradual delays are easy to justify, until they stack. Now step back and look at the full picture. You have a structure of fixed costs. You have exposure to timing risk. You have overlapping responsibilities increasing pressure. And on top of all that, you have an identity that encourages you to maintain everything exactly as it is. That's a powerful combination, not because any one part is overwhelming, because all of them exist at the same time. That's what creates the feeling many people can't quite articulate. Everything is working, but it feels tight. Progress is happening, but it doesn't feel like freedom. Effort is high, but the outcome feels uncertain. That's not confusion, that's structure. And once you see it clearly, one thing becomes obvious. This doesn't fix itself. Time alone doesn't solve it. In some cases, time makes it worse, because the longer the structure remains unchanged, the more embedded it becomes, which means the cost of changing it increases, financially, emotionally, socially. So the question becomes simple. Not easy, but simple. At what point do you adjust? Before pressure forces it, or after? Because waiting doesn't remove the need, it just removes the convenience. And that's where most people find themselves, not at the beginning of a problem, but somewhere in the middle of it, with enough awareness to feel it, but not enough distance to easily change it. That's the moment that matters most, because small adjustments here still have time to compound, still have time to create options, still have time to change direction, but only if they're made. And that brings us to the final piece. What actually shifts this? Not theory, not general advice, specific actions, the kind that create real change when time is still on your side.
At some point, everything becomes clear. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to realize that continuing the same way won't lead where you thought it would. Enough to feel the pressure behind the structure. Enough to understand that time is no longer something you can casually trade. That moment matters, because from there, two paths open up. One is passive. You keep everything as it is. You hope conditions improve. You tell yourself you'll adjust later. You rely on time, income, and the market to carry the weight. And sometimes that works. But when it doesn't, the correction is forced, abrupt, expensive. The other path is intentional. You step back. You look directly at what you've built. Not how it feels, not how it looks, what it actually costs. And more importantly, what it allows. Because that's the real metric. Not income, not net worth on paper. What your current structure allows you to do. Can you reduce your workload without stress? Can you walk away from a bad situation? Can you absorb an unexpected expense without destabilizing everything? Can you choose rest without consequence? If the answer to those questions is no, then something needs to change. Not everything, just enough to create space. And space starts with clarity. The first thing to understand is your true baseline. Not an estimate, not a rough idea, a real number. What does it cost to maintain your life each month before anything optional? Housing, transportation, insurance, recurring obligations, commitments you can't easily remove. Add them up carefully. That number is your foundation, and it tells you more than any investment return ever will. Because if that number is too high relative to your income, no strategy fixes it. No market performance compensates for it. It becomes the limiting factor in everything else. Once you see that number clearly, the next step becomes obvious. You don't need to eliminate everything. You don't need to overhaul your entire life. You need to identify pressure points. The few things that, if adjusted, would meaningfully reduce that baseline. Not dozens, one or two. Because in most cases, the majority of the weight comes from a small number of commitments. And deep down, you already know what they are. The thing you hesitate to look at. The one that feels locked in. That's usually where the leverage is. And yes, adjusting it might feel uncomfortable. It might require change. But compare that discomfort to the alternative. Years of reduced flexibility. Years of dependence on continued output. Years of carrying something that no longer serves you. Put side by side, the choice becomes clearer. The second shift is understanding how your money is actually working. Not in theory, in reality. What are you paying to have it managed? What are the underlying costs inside your investments? How much of your return are you keeping, and how much is leaving quietly over time? These questions don't require expertise. They require attention, because small percentages matter more than most people expect. Reducing friction in your financial system doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't create a story, but it creates efficiency, and efficiency compounds.
Over years, that difference becomes meaningful. Not because you chased higher returns, but because you kept more of what was already yours. The third shift is stress testing your assumptions. Not the ideal scenario, the difficult one. What happens if things don't go smoothly? If income pauses? If markets decline at the wrong time? If expenses increase unexpectedly? Not as a thought exercise, as a real scenario. Would your current structure hold, or would it strain immediately? Because resilience isn't built during calm periods, it's revealed during disruption. And if your plan only works when everything goes right, it's not a plan, it's a projection. The goal isn't to predict the future perfectly, it's to make sure you can handle variation, because variation is guaranteed. Now, none of this requires perfection. It doesn't require extreme sacrifice. It requires awareness, followed by a few deliberate adjustments. That's it. But those adjustments have to happen while there's still time for them to matter, because time is the multiplier, not effort, not intensity. Time. Give a good decision enough time, and it grows. Delay it long enough, and even the right decision loses impact. That's why this window matters so much. You still have time for change to compound, but not indefinitely. And that's not meant to create urgency out of fear. It's meant to create clarity. Because once you understand the structure you're operating in, you can start to reshape it. Slowly, deliberately, without chaos, without overcorrection. Just small shifts that move you toward flexibility instead of away from it. And over time, those shifts add up. They reduce pressure. They increase margin. They restore options. And options are the entire goal. Not early retirement, not a specific number. Options. The ability to choose how you spend your time. The ability to adjust when life changes. The ability to step back without everything collapsing. That's what financial stability actually is. Not appearance, not status, not maintaining a certain image. Real stability is quiet. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't require constant input. It supports you instead of the other way around. And the people who reach that point aren't the ones who did everything perfectly. They're the ones who noticed early enough and adjusted while it still mattered. They reduced what was unnecessary. They simplified what was complicated. They focused on what actually moved the outcome, and they let go of what didn't. That's the shift. From maintaining everything to keeping only what works. From carrying weight to creating space. From reacting to choosing. It doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, one decision at a time. And the earlier those decisions start, the more powerful they become. Because in the end, this isn't about money, it's about control. Control over your time, your energy, your direction. And once you start moving toward that, everything else begins to align around it. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. And that's enough.